What's up, everybody? Last night I had the chance to sit down and watch Rebel Moon Part 2, the director's cut, so let's talk about it. First thing I wanted to talk about is I felt like this was a very satisfying conclusion to the story that they had set up in Part 1, with Admiral Noble and the entire Imperium trying to invade Velt. So I felt like the whole ending and where they left the movie off with that story was indeed very satisfying for me. And then with that, this movie had teased a very, huge battle for the invasion of Velt, and I felt like it delivered on that, just like in part one. Zack Snyder is always great with action and action scenes, and I felt like the whole ending battle sequence itself was no different. Every action scene, it was very violent, very edge of your seat stuff, very high stakes, obviously. Um, with what's at stake. It felt like anyone can die, and basically everything I said about part one, when it comes to the action and the battle scene, I felt like also applied to part two. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the developed relationship between Cora and Gunner. They had kind of hinted at that, had a little bit of a back and forth unsaid thing in the first film, but in this one, emotions come out, they reveal how they feel to one another, and their relationship to me was the heart of the film. It was the emotional core of the film. Pretty graphic sex scene between them at the beginning of the movie, which threw me off a little bit. Especially, I understand why it was in the movie to contrast with a similar scene in the first one. But threw me off a little bit, so forewarning for anyone who doesn't like that in their movies. But yeah, their relationship, though, throughout the entire film, I felt was the heart of the film and the thing you cared most about and developed the story the most. So, and then to piggyback off of that, I felt like, we kind of got the final flashback for Cora's backstory in this film, and it definitely answered some questions that we had from part one. And in those scenes, I was very, very intrigued. And I loved how those scenes played out. So, because like I said, I had questions from part one with her backstory that I felt like they were leaving out, and they kind of teased that in part one. But once you get the answers in part two, I felt like those were very satisfying. And then another thing I wanted to talk about that I didn't really include in my review of part one, that I'll include here, is the soundtrack on both of these films. The score I felt like was very epic and very fitting, and was great for the film. I really noticed it in a couple of different scenes in part two. So maybe that was why it was more off the top of my head. But yeah, I felt like in both films, the soundtrack was great. Which is another staple of Zack Snyder movies. I feel like, yeah, great score. And then another complaint that I had about part one was that, I kind of felt like even with the longer running time, that some of the side characters didn't really get a moment to shine or have as much screen time as I would have liked. But I felt like with some of the side characters in part two, they kind of corrected that a bit. I really felt like General Titus, especially, had a pretty great redemptive character arc. So, there was a lot of good stuff from him. And then also, and even in part one, Jimmy the Robot, he was awesome, especially in the big battle sequence at the end. I felt like he had some scene stealing moments in the action department, so that was kind of satisfying since he, in part one, was kind of, just in the shadows and having his own existential crisis. I feel like he really got some moments to shine here in part two, so I enjoyed that. But with all that being said, overall though, I do have to say I was a little disappointed with part two compared to part one. So I wanted to get into a couple of things that I was negative on. And the first thing I want to talk about that is my biggest complaint about this film in general is the pacing in this film is just god awful and not good. I had pacing issues in part one, but it started strong and then ended strong, so I didn't really overall feel those by the end of the movie. But like in this movie, the first like hour and a half of this movie, and it's only 3 hours, mind you, um, almost nothing happens. Like, and I'm not exaggerating. You get some backstory here and there on certain characters, but for that first hour and a half, really nothing goes on, and I would almost call it boring. Really, it was that bad in that first half of that movie. This movie is really saved by the back half, but even there's some issues there. And like my biggest example of that is there is, a scene where it's I think it might have been the night before or a couple nights before. They knew they were going to be going into this big battle, and they're all sitting at a table, and it just goes through each character and their backstory. And I had complained in part one about how I felt like the side characters didn't get enough, either backstory or just like screen time for me to care about them. And then this film does the opposite, where it just gives everyone's backstory, but then it happens so quickly, and then we just move on, and then you don't really see a lot of those characters again or interact with them that much that you don't really care. So yeah, I mean, it was just a weird way to try to, you know, put more meat on the bones of these characters and then not do it effectively whatsoever. And then in the first half of that movie, I complained about in part one as well. The slow mo was just like unbelievably out of control. I mean, in the first hour and a half of this movie, like there are so many scenes of them just farming in slow mo, and I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, this is just a waste of time. Where it really felt like he was trying to pad the runtime at that point, and then it makes you wonder, like, why did we have a 3 hour part two if you didn't have anything really to do to fill the runtime for the entire first half of the movie? So yeah, I mean, like an hour and a half into this movie, I was like, wow, this is such a step down from part one, and I'm almost calling it bad, right? So yeah, pacing in this movie was just god awful. And then even though I think that the second half of the film is much better, it is basically at that hour and a half mark. You start the final battle and the invasion of Zelt, and that is basically the entire second half of the movie. So for me, even though I enjoyed the action scenes and I enjoyed that battle, it dragged on way too long. It did not need to be an hour and a half. This movie was a tale of two halves, and both of them had pacing issues. For basically the same reasons. They just went on way too long. This movie did not need to be 3 hours long, and you really felt it by the time you got to the end of the film. So that's kind of just going to go into my, last point about the pacing is that I really feel between these two movies that there was no reason for it to total over 6 hours. I really felt like Zach could have either, even with the R rating in his director's cut, because I know the PG-13 versions were like 2 hours apiece. He could have did the same amount of runtime, but then just added in the R-rated stuff and maybe some of the background stuff and cut a lot of this stuff that happened out. Out of these 6 hours in total, I mean, there's really only like three and a half that actually had me intrigued and actually had me invested. So I really felt like a lot of the runtime for both, like in totality in both movies, was just there was way too much. It didn't need to be 6 hours, and that's just what it is. And then I also felt like while the story with Admiral Noble and the invasion of Svelte, there that was satisfying. That storyline was concluded properly. There was a lot of other dangling threads that were not concluded, and that clearly Snyder, had put in there to set up for any future installments. But now, with the way that these films have performed on Netflix, I'm not even sure that we're going to get to that. So it's kind of just another Justice League situation all over again where he teased a bunch of different storylines that could happen in future movies, but those future movies aren't going to come. So it kind of leaves a sour taste in your mouth because you're like, well, yeah, I enjoyed some of this, but then a lot of it didn't get resolved, and we don't know if it's ever going to happen because we don't know if there's ever going to be a movie. So yeah, that was another part that was just a little bit disappointing to me. So yeah, guys, overall, definitely was not as happy with part two as I was with part one. And part one wasn't perfect, but this one was definitely a step down to me. Like I said, didn't hate it. I still like both of these movies, and I feel like this world is a world that I would like to be explored, but I don't know if it's going to happen. So, yeah, that kind of sucks, but it is what it is. But for this rating, on this one, I'm going to give it a 3.25 out of 5. So, yeah, if you guys have seen both cuts of Rebel Moon, the director's cuts, comment below. Let me know what you thought of them. So, yeah, have a great night.